Thank you, Professor Andrew Knight, for joining us here at DoGood. It's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for taking the time out of your day. Could you just start with just telling everyone your background and any specific areas of research or your interests?
Sure. So I'm a small animal vet. I spent nearly a decade treating cats and dogs and other domestic pets, mostly around London, before being recruited to go and teach at one of the world's largest veterinary schools in the Caribbean in 2013. And from 2015, I had the opportunity to set up a new centre for animal welfare at the University of Winchester, 1 hour south of London. So I lead the centre. We have several degree programs. I run a distance learning master's program in animal welfare. And we do a lot of research as well. We're probably one of the university's most active centres. And my current area of research is all about pet food. So I've been looking at vegan and alternative pet foods and looking at the health outcomes of cats and dogs maintained on them, looking at the palatability, so the behavioural outcomes of cats and dogs on different diets, and looking at the processes that manufacturers use to produce these diets, and also looking at the environmental sustainability of different choices. So we've got a range of scientific publications and short summary videos about all of this coming out this year and next year. Sure. So dogs evolved from wolves, obviously. So the more inquisitive, bold wolves around early human campfires and settlements sometimes started to be fed scraps of food by our ancestors. And this led to the domestication of these early wolves. And it's thought that this occurred somewhere between about 14 and 40,000 years ago. That's been sufficient time for them to change their biochemistry, their anatomy somewhat, so that they can derive nutritional benefit from human food scraps. So that's the root vegetables that our ancestors used to dig up from the ground and cook on the early campfires. It's scraps of the prey animals that they would hunt. So they developed this anatomy that instead of being purely carnivorous as wolves used to be, they became able to derive nutritional benefit from a much wider variety of foodstuffs. And so they became biologically omnivorous. So they have the biochemical pathways to obtain nutritional benefit from things like starchy food sources and from carbohydrates, as well as from proteins from meat. So they can do well on a mixed diet. Yes, of course. Many people make the mistake of thinking that ingredients are the same as nutrients, and of course they're not. Dogs and cats and all species have requirements for a certain set of nutrients. They don't have any requirements biologically for any particular ingredient. So if we formulate a diet comprised entirely of plants, minerals and synthetic sources, and that diet is formulated to supply all the nutrients that are needed, there's no reason to expect that dogs, cats or any other species will do badly on it. And indeed, that's what the evidence indicates. So there have been a couple of large-scale studies and a small-scale study looking at the health of dogs maintained on plant-based diets. There was one published in British Journal of Nutrition a number of years ago showing that sprint racing Siberian Huskies, which are dogs that probably have about the highest exercise and calorie demands of virtually any dog you could think of, pulling sleds through heavy snow for miles on end, for days on end, sprint racing Siberian Huskies. So the plant-based ones did just as well as the meat-based dogs in that particular study. They were assessed throughout by veterinarians, had blood tests throughout. All of them changed. They all became more athletically adapted with increased red blood cell counts and fitness and so on. And more recently, there have been a couple of large-scale population studies of dogs maintained on vegan diets and comparing health outcomes to those of dogs on meat-based diets. They haven't yet been published, and they're coming out later this year, so it's very exciting. These will be the first really large-scale population studies of dogs. I can give you a sneak preview and tell you that the results seem to indicate that the vegan dogs are at least as healthy in virtually every respect. So they may even have certain advantages compared to dogs on conventional meat-based diets. We have had a recent study that was published just a couple of months ago on cats, and it showed the same outcome actually, providing the diet's formulated to provide all the nutrients that the animals need. the cats in this study had certain health benefits, actually, and a healthier body weight was one of them. We'd probably expect to see that in dogs as well. Dogs and cats becoming overweight and obese is one of the most common health problems today, and it's well known that plant-based diets for people tend to result in a reduction in body weight, and I suspect it's probably true for our companion animals as well. So I expect we'll be seeing those benefits, but we'll have to wait for the full study results soon. Well, when I, many years ago, went looking for evidence to support the common belief that cats in particular couldn't be healthy on vegan diets, I couldn't actually find any studies in the scientific literature apart from one where a diet was deliberately formulated to be deficient in potassium and cats maintained on it for a period of time. Guess what? Got potassium deficiency. Amazing. But I couldn't find any other studies. I accidentally found more than 10 studies showing that cats and dogs maintained on conventional meat-based diets over periods of time were developing various health problems. So there are many other reports also in the in books about the subject and on the internet, on websites where people are interested in health of cats and dogs on different diets, which are basically a whole bunch of case reports showing the common problems that these animals have. Common problems can be things like being obese or overweight, mobility problems, diabetes, visual disorders, cataracts. People report gastrointestinal problems, musculoskeletal, cardiac, and some other problems as well. So it's interesting to speculate about why this might occur. We know there are lots of additives that are added into conventional meat-based diets, whether they be preservatives. There are a bunch of preservatives that are potentially hazardous and have been banned from European produce, but are still being used in places like the United States, and imported brands may still have those within them, even though they are quite hazardous. There are various other potential hazards as well. Free radicals from continued overcooking of restaurant grease in fast food and other restaurants, which is then sold on to be used in pet food manufacturing as a source of oils and fats, carbonated waste products in those. There are bacteria, protozoal, fungal, prion, and even helminth, that is to say intestinal worms and the eggs, parasites that can be associated with meat-based diets sometimes. It's well known that people that feed raw meat diets in particular, the animals on the raw meat diets are much more likely to have infections with pathogenic bacteria, which they obtain from the raw meat. Raw meat's a very risky thing to be dealing with. You have to handle it in very careful and specific ways to minimize the risk of bacterial contamination of your animal, your kitchen, yourself. There are a very large number of studies showing that dogs on those diets have high rates of bacterial colonization, and also the owners in those households also do, so they're picking it up from their animals. There are fungal contaminants. There's a range of problems that have been described in textbooks about pet food manufacturing and scientific articles about these sorts of hazards. So plant-based diets, I guess no diet is necessarily 100% immune, but we don't tend to see the range of industrial additives being added into these diets. They certainly don't have the pathogens that are associated with meat-based diets. So possibly there are less hazards associated with these diets. And if you feed something to an animal daily, which is potentially hazardous for the duration of its lifetime, even if the hazard is at a low level, you might well see tissue changes eventually. And we certainly are seeing with old cats and dogs increasing rates of problems such as liver disease, kidney disease, heart disorders, and of course, obesity as well. So it may well be that long-term exposure to dietary hazards is having adverse effects for cats and dogs fed conventional diets. It should be said that some of these additives are, of course, beneficial. There are antimicrobial products. There are vitamins and minerals, which are also additives as well. But we're talking about the potentially hazardous ingredients, particularly in conventional meat-based diets. The environmental impacts of pet food is a really interesting area because it hasn't really been on very many people's radar until really recently. In 2017, a key study was published by Ocken in the United States demonstrating that the environmental impacts of the livestock sector, which we already know are substantial. The livestock sector produces about 15 to 16% of all human-generated greenhouse gases. It consumes about 80% of the world's agricultural land to produce only less than 20% of calories available for us to consume. So we know the livestock sector has really big environmental impacts. What we didn't know is how much of that is attributable to the pet food sector. Ocken calculated that 25 to 30% of the impacts are attributable to the pet food sector. So that's 25 to 30% of all the land that is used, the water that's used, the pesticides, fertilizers, greenhouse gases produced, and so on. There have been a couple of additional studies published since that time, which have also demonstrated significant environmental impacts of pet food. What we haven't done, though, is looked at how those metrics would improve if we switched animals onto, let's say, vegan diets. And of course, there are other options available too. There is yeast-based diets, there's fungi, seaweed, developing in vitro meat products, and so on. So there'll be more options available in the future. It's probably a pretty safe bet to assume that the plant-based diets will have a much lower environmental footprint than the meat-based diets, because we know this with human food as well. We haven't done the calculations. That's my research area for this year, actually. I'm hoping to quantify those and work out how much it will save in terms of environmental metrics. And so look for the forthcoming short summary video and scientific publication on that later, probably next year. They'll be likely to be published.
Fantastic. I mean, 25 to 30% of the environmental impact of the meat industry as a whole is huge. And it's amazing that it's overlooked by people in general, has been in the past. And one of the things we're trying to push forward is that, dogs eat calories the same as humans. And, a larger dog can eat the same amount of calories as a human does. And therefore, if they're eating purely meat-based, it's going to have the same environmental impact as you eating a meat-based diet yourself. And we know that from, the media and studies of the impact that has.
It certainly is true. So there was a study by Sue and Martins looking at dogs in Japan and found that a medium-sized dog in Japan has a equal or greater ecological paw print than the dietary environmental footprint of an average Japanese person. And of course, a large dog will have a larger footprint than that of an average Japanese person. Of course, a very small dog would have less, a cat would have less. So it does depend on the size of the animal. But also the extent to which the diet is plant-based. A horse is a very large animal, but would have a very low footprint because its diet is entirely plant-based. So if we can safely switch our cats and dogs onto plant-based diets, there are the potential for really large environmental benefits. And all we need to do is to formulate them to provide all the nutrients that cats and dogs require, which we can very much do. I think that the key ethical concern would be to consider the millions of food animals who live often very shortened lives in often relatively deprived conditions in intensive farms, subjected to a range of husbandry procedures with often inadequate or lacking painkillers, and then are slaughtered at a early stage of life. To produce pet food and, of course, food for human beings as well. The numbers of animals we're talking about are in the many millions. In the United Kingdom, we kill around about 1 billion farmed animals each year. So even if just a minor percentage of those go into pet food, that is still very large numbers. So that's the biggest animal welfare and ethical concern. The other thing we need to ensure is that our cats and dogs receive all the nutrients that they need, and that they're happy to eat these new diets if we're switching them on to plant-based diets. And it's no problem at all to formulate those diets to ensure that they do receive all the nutrients that they need to do so. Responsible companies aim to do that. And the happiness of cats and dogs on different diets has been one of the research questions that I've tackled this last year, and we're hoping to publish very soon a scientific paper looking at this in detail. But the headline result is that the very large numbers of cats and dogs we had in our study on the vegan diets seemed to be, as far as we could tell by detailed analysis of their behaviour, seemed to be just as happy as the ones on the meat-based diets. Pet ownership around the world is actually increasing. There are around about 3 billion out of the world's 7 or so billion people who are living in developing nations such as China, where their disposable income is increasing. And as this occurs, they are shifting their lifestyles. They often seek to emulate what they see as being the affluent and desirable lifestyles of westernized nations. And as part of that change, they're changing their own personal consumption patterns, eating a lot more animal products, but they're also starting to greatly increase their rates of companion animal ownership. So the numbers of pets around the world are set to sharply rise. The other trend that's occurring is that the so-called humanization of our pets. So it's been said that dogs used to inhabit the back garden and then moved into the living room, and now have moved into the bedroom and up onto the bed over the last several decades. There has been a humanization of our companion animals. We see them increasingly as members of our own family. We want and expect high standards of medical care, better diets for them, and so on. As part of this process, there's less use of byproducts of the slaughtering industry for human consumption, and there is greater use of animals being slaughtered directly for pet food consumption. So because of these two trends combined, the environmental and animal welfare impacts of pet food are set to rise substantially in coming decades. And we do indeed need to substantially decrease the impacts of our food production systems for ourselves and also for our pets if we're going to address the overwhelmingly urgent concerns of climate change, biodiversity loss, and animal welfare that we're facing now and in the future. Sure. So we have conducted a survey of over 4,000 pet owners. We had more than 2,500 dogs and more than 1,300 cats in our sample. And we looked at the health outcomes for the cats and dogs. We looked at the behavioural outcomes. We looked at 10 different indicators of palatability in dogs. So whether they bark when they're fed, rush up to their food bowl, try to guard their food, all the sorts of things that you would expect to indicate how much dogs like their food. We looked at 15 indicators of this in cats. We looked at the steps taken by manufacturers in great detail, all the way from initial staffing used during the design of recipes, so the level of expertise in nutrition used during recipe design, every step in manufacturing through to final shipping of product to retailers and to consumers and the guidelines provided to them. To look at how thorough were these steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness by plant-based versus meat-based manufacturers. So we looked at all of that. So all of this research is coming out this year and next year, along hopefully with additional research into how the environmental sustainability metrics change when you feed plant-based pet foods. So how many additional people could be fed with the food energy saved, how many food animal lives could be spared, how much land could you save, water, fossil fuels, pesticides, fertilizers, and greenhouse gases would you save. So that is hopefully coming out as well next year. Definitely make sure that the diet is nutritionally complete and reasonably balanced. It is possible to make a homemade diet. These are much less likely to be nutritionally complete for dogs. Even if people add in a supplement, there have been quite a lot of studies published now showing that homemade diets are very commonly not nutritionally complete. So unless you're a nutritional expert, I wouldn't recommend trying it yourself. I'd recommend purchasing a diet from a reputable commercial company that has clearly taken good steps during the design and manufacture of its products. Look for labeling information to indicate the product is nutritionally complete for the species and potentially of a life stage concern. You might be looking at, say, puppies versus pregnant versus normal adults, and things like that. So I think that's the most important thing. There is a slightly different advice for cats, but you've asked me about dogs, and that's the key advice, I think, for dogs. The other thing is perhaps make any dietary changes gradually, ideally over a couple of weeks. It provides more time for the digestive enzymes to transition and for the bacteria and protozoa in the gut to change over, so that there's less likely to be any adverse reactions from the intestines on the new product.